In the Ruhr industrial region of 1944, the air was never transparent. It always carried a greyish thickness, like an old cloth hanging down from the sky, crumpled countless times, and then dyed again by smokestacks and scorched earth. When Helene Bauer walked through the streets, she often felt she was moving through some kind of sedimentary layer formed by coal dust, construction powder, acidic fumes leaking from chemical plants, and the fine particles that floated everywhere after bomb explosions, all pressed together in the air. She was 17, and by all rights should have been running on a school playground like other girls her age, but war, like an invisible giant hand, suddenly plucked her out of the classroom and hurled her into an era she had never chosen. Within just a few years, her world kept shrinking, from the tidy neighborhood of her childhood to the confines of an air raid shelter, and then further into a flak position where her life revolved around a rickety wooden table, a small light bulb, and a set of plotting boards that never seemed to come clean. She believed this was the inevitable path of growing up, and that everyone must have grown up this way. In her childhood, rolls of toilet paper had once been so ordinary that no one paid attention to them. She remembered how her mother would neatly place the white rolls on the storage shelf beside the kitchen, as naturally as storing flour or bars of soap. Yet as the war escalated, these rolls evaporated from the city like water. Paper mills shut down, wood pulp was given priority for military packaging, and even newspapers began to shrink. By the winter of 1943, there were no intact rolls of paper left in the house. In their place were piles of cut-up old newspapers and strips of grey cloth that had been washed dozens of times. Her mother told her, "In wartime, everyone is the same. Don't be picky." She nodded, assuming it was the truth. She had never seen any other way of living and had never questioned whether a lack of cleanliness, a lack of privacy, and a lack of comfort could really be considered reasonable. When she was conscripted as an air defense auxiliary, most of the people around her were girls just like her. The school used propaganda posters to tell them, "You are the guardians of the fatherland's sky." When the uniforms were issued, each of them felt a sense of being chosen, but that sense of honor was quickly swallowed by the reality of the flak positions. The batteries were hastily set up on ground pitted by bomb craters, and the air was constantly filled with a pungent smell of burning rubber mixed with wet soil. The shelters were dark and damp. Light bulbs flickered constantly, and the walls trembled slightly with each shock. The latrines were nothing more than makeshift pit sheds and a few planks of wood. Everyone had to take a deep breath before going in, only to be choked to the point of tears once inside. Paper was a precious commodity, and being able to use even a few sheets of rough recycled paper counted as good fortune. Most of the time, the girls used damp newspapers or pages torn from discarded documents, pages still printed with half-legible orders, notices of cancelled events, and outdated battle reports. The act of using these papers was both painful and shameful, yet they had grown accustomed to it. Someone would joke, "A few more wipes and we'll rub the ink right off." Everyone would laugh, and in that laughter there was a forced resilience as well as a kind of helpless acceptance. Yet Helene slowly became aware that something in her heart was growing heavier. It was the great air raids that came every few months. When the sirens wailed, the ground shook, and the sky was torn into bands of blood red and deep black. She would hide in the shelter, listening as the ground above was shattered layer by layer, as houses collapsed with hollow cracks, and as the wind blew ash into everyone's hair, between their fingers, and into their breathing. After one such air raid ended, she saw the ruins of what had once been a department store. The glass windows had shattered into countless shards, the wooden shelves were crushed into twisted wreckage, and the floor was strewn with packaging paper soaked to mush by rain and torn, ragged labels. Under a section of caved-in flooring, she saw something that seemed almost unreal, a roll of toilet paper that had been completely soaked through, swollen and unusable, like a clump of white pulp sediment. She stared at it for a long time. She suddenly realized that this small item, once ubiquitous in her childhood, had completely vanished from her life. Its disappearance came without ceremony, without grief, without even being mentioned. One day it was still on the shelf, and the next day it was gone, never to return. In that moment, for the first time, She felt a very faint doubt. Were all these things they were forced to endure truly natural and inevitable? But war never gave a young girl much time to think. In the spring of 1945, the Ruhr industrial region collapsed completely. Allied forces advanced from the south, north, and west simultaneously, forming a massive encirclement. Fuel supplies were cut off, railways were paralyzed, and the command system descended into chaos. The Air Defense Auxiliary Unit, to which Helene belonged, was ordered to retreat eastward, but the retreat route was filled with collapsed bridges and tracks blown into twisted metal. Many girls became lost along the way. Many others sobbed as they discarded their equipment, hoping only to find some hole in the ground where they could hide from the shelling. In the end, outside a small town whose name could no longer be clearly recognized, she and the remaining members of the unit surrendered to the American forces. In the hours following the surrender, she was taken with others to a temporary prisoner-of-war holding area. Propaganda had once painted horrifying scenes for them. Female prisoners would be humiliated, stripped of dignity, and brutally punished. Because of this, she could hardly lift her head, afraid that any detail might provoke insult. She was terrified that someone would see her filthy shoes, her worn-out socks, or the skin chafed raw during the long retreat. She was even afraid the Americans would mock her for lacking signs of proper bathing or clean paper. She still kept what little paper she had pressed at the very bottom of her pocket, as if pressing down a faint talisman. Yet she had not expected that the Americans' procedures would be so orderly. No shouting, no beatings. Registration, medical checks, allocation of bunks, everything was carried out as methodically as an assembly line in a factory. She remained tense, but beneath that tension there gradually seeped in a strange confusion. The enemy she had imagined did not seem to be acting in the way propaganda had described. When she was put aboard an ocean-going ship, this confusion only grew stronger. The ship's hold was not spacious, but at least it was clean. The toilets were fixed metal fixtures, supplied with water and a flushing system, and they were cleaned regularly. The duty soldiers handed out thin tissues in measured amounts, softer than any recycled paper she had used in Germany. She still did not dare use them freely, pinching only the smallest pieces between her fingertips, as if each scrap were a treasure that might vanish at any moment. She did not know where she was being taken, only that it was to a place completely different from the world of her childhood, a country she had been repeatedly taught to hate and to regard with constant vigilance. She did not yet know that an even greater shock awaited her. It would come in the form of a white object so simple it could be no simpler, a role she believed could only appear in the bathrooms of aristocrats in a bygone age. When she first saw it, she thought it would be her cherished possession for an entire month. She did not know that behind it stood an entirely different view of the world. During the voyage across the Atlantic, Helene's world was compressed into a rocking iron ship's hold. There were no windows, and she could only feel the damp, salt air through the ventilation openings. Each time the hull dipped and rose again, it churned her empty stomach. The other captive girls curled up in their hammocks, trying to press the last fragments of home against their chests, a worn scarf, a broken brooch, or a letter soaked by rain during the retreat. Yet what most unsettled Helene was not the waves, but the fear of the unknown. She had never left Germany and had never truly seen the enemy's land. Propaganda had taught her to believe that Americans were crude, brutal, and bloodthirsty, especially merciless toward female prisoners. Because of this, she did not dare even remove her shoes when she slept, afraid she might be dragged up in the middle of the night to face humiliation. But reality did not match her fears. Most of the soldiers on the ship were busy with their shifts and duties. When they passed by, they merely glanced over, and no one showed the cruelty she had imagined. To them, the prisoners were simply part of the machinery of war, units of manpower being transported to a camp to be registered, housed, and managed, not targets, not prey. This cool, impersonal sense of order only deepened her confusion. Why was it that in Germany every aspect of life was collapsing, while here even the enemy's treatment of prisoners could remain so steady? She did not sleep well. Whenever the lights in the hold went out, she would be trapped by a recurring illusion. as if she were still lying in a Ruhr air raid shelter, the shrill sirens ready to sound at any moment, the ground ready to be hurled upward by explosions. Her body remembered that fear. Every metallic clank made her think of anti-aircraft shrapnel striking the outside of the shelter. When she reached into her pocket, her fingers would touch a thin sheet of paper folded into an impossibly neat rectangle. It was a scrap she had secretly taken from the remnants of a German storage room before boarding, meant to serve as her final, last line during the long uncertainty ahead. She could only fall asleep by gripping it, as if holding onto a slender thread that could pull her back to her former world. Crossing the Atlantic took weeks. During the day she was occasionally allowed onto the deck for air. It was her first time seeing the real ocean, not the coloured patch on a map, not the idealised deep blue of propaganda posters, but a boundless, relentless force that pounded endlessly against the hull. Sunlight scattered across the surface, moving like shards of shattered glass. Standing at the rail and watching that glittering expanse, she suddenly thought that if she were to jump now, her whole body would be swallowed in a matter of seconds. War had put her on this ship, but she had no idea what sort of future the ship was carrying her toward. Then, one morning, the ship suddenly slowed, and a scent she had never known before drifted through the air, a mixture of damp earth, pine, gasoline, and something she could only describe as freshness. The soldiers began making preparations to dock, and the sound of shouted orders and ropes grating against metal spread along the deck. She was led up from below, down the gangway, onto a wharf unlike anything she had seen before. It was not German ruin, not rubble, but a bright, open space that seemed untouched by war. Trucks carried them toward the prisoner of war camp. The scenery along the road gradually stripped away the pillars of her worldview. Wide roads, orderly farms, neat wooden houses, schools that had not been bombed. She saw children chasing each other in yards, saw brightly coloured advertisements hanging outside shop doors, saw people waiting at a station with clean, crisp newspapers in their hands. Each scene seemed to tell her, there exists a way of life that has never been destroyed, never reduced to ruins. She suddenly realized that people here might never have heard the whine of falling bombs, might not know what it was to run under blaring sirens. Her stomach tightened with a strange pain that was neither jealousy nor fear, but a sharp ache born of the realization that the world is not made of suffering alone. The prisoner of war camp stood deep within a pine forest. Barbed wire fenced off a vast area, and guards patrolled the watchtowers. But the overall layout resembled a school or factory far more than the cages she had imagined. The barracks were rows of neat wooden huts, the paths made of red earth, and nearby stood kitchens, laundry areas, warehouses, an infirmary, and even a small drill field. Her first reaction was not a sense of safety, but shock. Everything here seemed intact. There were no broken walls, no charred ruins, no fountain-like craters left by air raids. She even felt there was a quiet here that bordered on the unreal. After getting off the truck, they lined up for physical examinations. The infirmary had electric fans, and white porcelain dishes and metal instruments were neatly arranged. The walls were clean, bearing no scars of war. The doctor's movements as he examined her were mechanical but not rough. He noted her malnutrition and mild anemia, then handed her a bar of soap, a complete bar, new, uncut, without cracks. She stared at it for several seconds before daring to take it. The last time she had seen a whole bar of soap in Germany had been 2 years earlier. When she was led to the bathhouse, every muscle in her body tensed. She had never experienced showers in an enemy camp and did not know what to expect. But when the door of the bathhouse swung open, she froze. Inside was a long row of showerheads, water flowing steadily from the metal pipes. The floor was clean cement and tile, with no mud, no stench. Clean towels hung from hooks, and a few sheets of paper instructions explained how to adjust the water temperature. Steam filled the air, and for the first time she smelled a gentle fragrance, the warm scent of hot water and soap mingled together, something she had never known in all those dark nights fleeing into shelters. But what truly split her life into a before and after came in the moments that followed. After finishing her shower, she walked toward the barracks toilet. It was a bright little room with several stalls in a row, the doors fitting tightly, unlike the rickety wooden doors in Germany that offered almost no privacy. She opened one of the stalls, intending, as she always did, to use as little paper as possible to stay clean. But when she raised her head, she saw that thing. It was smooth, dry, and so white it was almost dazzling, hanging neatly on the wall. The paper was soft and thick, each layer evenly dense, with no frayed edges, no coarse wood fibers, no spots of printer's ink. It was a complete brand-new roll of toilet paper. In her world, such an object had been missing for 4 years. She had even assumed it might have been wiped out by the war altogether. She stared at it, her heart pounding wildly. She reached out her hand and then drew it back, as if she were about to touch some sacred relic. She could not believe that it was simply hanging there and that it was prepared for prisoners of war. She thought it must be part of some welcome display staged by the camp, put out only on the first day to showcase civilization and destined to disappear afterward. She began carefully tearing off a tiny piece, so small it was nearly impossible to hold. The softness of the paper made her almost dizzy. That texture belonged to another world, one she had never possessed and had not even dared to imagine. Before using it, she began to calculate. If she used only this much each day, one roll might last a month, perhaps even longer. At this thought, she quickly suppressed her breathing and gently left the remaining paper on the roll, as if any larger movement would cause others to notice her squandering a luxury. At one point, she even considered taking the roll down and hiding it under her bunk, like hiding a precious piece of jewelry. In those first few days, Helene felt almost a kind of reverence for that roll of paper. She treated it as a luxury object that did not truly belong to her, touching it lightly but hardly daring to use it. Every time she opened the toilet door and saw the roll hanging there unharmed, she would instinctively hold her breath, as though even the sound of her footsteps might disturb some sacred order. She was always silently calculating her usage, breaking her daily needs into the smallest possible quotas, trying to make the roll last as long as it could. Most of the other girls from Germany in the barracks were just as cautious. They too were used to saving every scrap, and they too believed that something like paper could not possibly be freely given to prisoners. They exchanged glances with one another, and in each other's eyes saw the same peculiar wariness, as if they were all touching a miracle, could be taken back at any moment. Then one day, the camp administration needed several prisoners to help with warehouse records. Because her handwriting was neater than most, and she had experience plotting coordinates at the flak position, the American sergeant in charge of the ledgers chose her. It was the first threshold leading her into the American supply system, a world for which she had no mental preparation. She followed the sergeant through the camp, passing the kitchen and the drill field, toward a long, inconspicuous wooden building. Numbers were painted on the door, and a few English forms she could not read were tacked to the windows. She assumed it might hold a few simple tools or sacks of food. She never imagined what would actually be inside. When the sergeant pulled open the heavy wooden door, a dry, faintly papery smell rushed out to meet her. It was a scent she had never encountered before, not the inky smell of books, nor the mustiness of old newspapers, but a new, clean odor, tinged with the slightest trace of fiber. She froze in the doorway. Before her rose a massive wall of paper stretching to the far end of the room. Row upon row of cartons were stacked from the floor almost to the ceiling, each box stamped with the same markings and numbers. The sergeant stepped inside, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, while she found herself almost unable to move her feet. She stared at those cartons, feeling her chest tighten little by little. She strained to read the words printed on the boxes, and when she caught the letters toilet tissue, her breathing nearly stopped altogether. Thinking she might have misread them, she stepped closer and let her fingertips lightly brush the rough cardboard. The texture told her these were not crates for grain, not boxes for soap, not packages for medical gauze. Inside these boxes were rolls of the very same paper she had regarded as a treasure in the toilet. Not just one roll, but dozens, hundreds, boxes upon boxes, stacked so neatly and in such numbers that she could not possibly gauge them by eye. The sergeant handed her a clipboard and a pencil, instructing her to record the week's distribution according to the paperwork. Her hands still trembled as she took them. She lowered her head to look at the form, which listed barracks numbers, head counts, and weekly consumption, and the figures in the column marked toilet paper left her mind utterly blank. They were not symbolic quantities, not small amounts distributed as needed, but regular supply figures like those for water, soap, and light bulbs. The rolls were issued weekly to every barracks with no distinctions of rank or status. She lifted her head and looked again at the wall of paper. The boxes rose layer by layer, like a silent white bastion, as if wordlessly declaring that in this country, in this camp, under this system, these rolls were not luxuries, not favors, and not rewards. They were the most basic of provisions, things that did not need to be questioned, fought for, or saved to the point of fear. A sudden numbness seized her chest, a sensation deeper than fear, sharper than shock. She thought of all those nights back in Germany, of the choking dampness and rot in the air raid shelters, of the tears the girls wiped from their cheeks with faded newspaper, of her mother in the kitchen, tearing a single sheet of paper into 4, then into 8, with that helpless silence on her face. She suddenly realized that the absence of such things had not been fate, had not been a natural disaster, had not been an inevitable experience shared by all nations, but the result of her own country being devoured by war and its systems, slowly training an entire society to accept a degraded, low baseline. She recalled herself in the toilet, carefully rationing out those tiny bits of paper. At the time, she had treated frugality as a duty, endurance as a virtue, and silence as an obligation. She had been taught to be strong, to suffer for the sake of the nation, to view scarcity as a badge of honor. But now she stood before a wall built of paper rolls, and every box, every roll, quietly testified that all her past endurance had not been necessary at all. In some places, the most basic cleanliness and dignity had never been seen as things that must be sacrificed. As she wrote down the numbers on the clipboard, the pencil shook in her hand. She raised her arm to wipe sweat from her forehead, and suddenly realized that her sweat did not smell acrid. It was because she had washed herself the day before with truly clean soap. In a daze, she thought, so this is the baseline a human being ought to have. After that day, her behavior changed quietly. She was still careful, but she no longer treated that roll as a treasure that had to last an entire month. She learned to use it as the other prisoners did, naturally, no longer tearing each sheet into minuscule pieces, no longer taking a deep breath before entering the toilet as if preparing for an ordeal. For the first time, she sensed that when a person no longer has to live in constant anxiety over the most basic needs, the mind gains room to think about larger questions. Yet what truly transformed her was something else that happened in the warehouse. One evening, the warehouse supervisor told her and a few other prisoners to register a newly arrived batch of supplies. She opened one of the boxes and found it full of clean, white rolls. As she stacked them neatly on the shelves, she heard a faint cough from the neighboring barracks. The sound was very weak. It belonged to an elderly German woman she had recently seen in the infirmary, worn out by long journeys and malnutrition, almost too feeble to walk. That day, the old woman had sat in the infirmary clutching her own collar, as if afraid of taking up too much space. She had not even asked for paper, only kept apologizing to the nurse. Helene hesitated, set down the completed form, and quietly picked up a roll. In a low voice, she asked the sergeant for permission to issue one extra. He merely glanced at her, and then nodded assent. At that moment, a heavy feeling flooded her chest. So here, asking for extra paper was not taboo at all. It required no shame, no hushed tones, and no apologies. Paper was not a reward, but a right. When she placed the roll in the old woman's hands, the expression on that lined face etched itself into her memory forever. There was surprise, a slight tremor, and a gratitude so intense it was almost tearful. It made Helene realize that her generation of Germans had been trained by the war not to dare hope for, let alone request, even the most basic things. That shrinking back was not a trait of character, but a reflex born from being pressed down by circumstances for too long. That night, back in the barracks, she lay awake on her bunk for a long time. Outside, the pines whispered in the night wind, making a sound like a vast sheet of paper being gently crumpled. She stared at the ceiling and, for the first time, truly understood that what she had lost in Germany was not just material goods, but an understanding of how a person ought to be treated. She had never seen any alternative standard, so she had always assumed her life was normal, necessary, something that must be endured. Now she had glimpsed another world, one that did not lower the minimum standard of human dignity because of war, fear, or propaganda. And all of this had been driven like a wedge into her old world by the most ordinary of objects, a roll of toilet paper. When news of repatriation spread through the camp, the air seemed to quiver with a complex vibration. Some people cheered, some fell silent, and many others simply stood there in a daze, as if someone had opened a pit to an unknown realm beneath their feet. Helene was among the dazed. She knew she would be going back to Germany, but she did not know whether that Germany still existed, nor how she should face the ruins, her family, or her former self. She did not even know whether she could still adapt to a way of life she had once considered entirely natural. The longer she worked in the warehouse, the harder it became to ignore the expanding wave of self-doubt. Why had her country taught her that enduring filth and deprivation was glorious? Why had she never questioned it? Why had she so readily accepted those coarse, damp, dignity-stripping conditions? Standing in the warehouse doorway, looking at the neatly stacked rolls, she felt they were like a silent mirror, reflecting the first 17 years of her life with brutal clarity. The sky was overcast on the day of her return. Several old trucks idled outside the station, their beds crowded with prisoners waiting to be taken to the port. She was assigned to one of them. As the truck lumbered into motion, it kicked up clouds of red dust, and the smell made her instantly aware of how accustomed she had become to the clean air of the American camp. She watched the barracks recede, shrinking into a pale cluster until the trees swallowed them from view. A strange feeling rose within her, as if she were not leaving a place of confinement, but a period of time that had rescued her from ignorance. The journey was long and crossed the sea once more. She was no longer afraid of the waves, but each night she lay staring at the ship's ceiling, silently repeating to herself the new, previously unimaginable baselines she had learned in America. She told herself that the measure of how civilized a country, a system, or a society is not how loudly it proclaims itself in victory, but what minimum standards it chooses to uphold when facing its enemies. She could not yet put this idea fully into words, but it had sunk so deep in her heart that even the rocking of the waves could not dislodge it. When she once again set foot on German soil, the air felt like a bowl of cold soup thick with ash. The railway station had no intact clock, no glass windows, only broken stones, shards of tiles, and charred wood scattered across the floor. Many buildings had only half a wall left, like forgotten bones. People wore patched clothing and carried iron pots or wooden stools salvaged from the ruins on their shoulders, their faces drawn and numb. As the line of returning prisoners moved forward slowly, she saw a makeshift public latrine built from rough planks. A long queue of people stood outside, their boots sinking into the mud as they waited, clutching crumpled newspapers or worn-out strips of cloth in their hands. In that instant, her steps faltered. It was the first time, since awakening in the American camp, that she was confronted with a scene from the old world. She suddenly realized that this was not some unavoidable condition she had been forced to accept while growing up, but a numbness forged by years of war and propaganda, a swallowed humiliation, a deeply rooted illusion that this is just how life is. A bitter taste rose in her chest, not directed at others, but at her own former, unquestioning endurance. Her home was no longer where it had been. She found her mother in a makeshift shack, thinner than she remembered, with a fragility in her eyes, carved by years of hardship. Her father's name was still on the missing list from the Eastern Front, with no further news. When her mother embraced her, she smelled dust, scorched earth, sweat, and the bitter tang of a life pushed to its limits. She did not cry. The tears would not come. She simply buried her face in her mother's shoulder, feeling as though she were embracing her past self across an entire ocean. Life had to start again from scratch. At the town relief office, she registered with the authorities and was assigned to work as a clerk in a temporary clinic. The clinic did not have enough medicine or beds, but at least there was a wooden counter where people could line up for basic supplies. Her job was to keep records of rations and distribution. Every day, dozens of people queued in front of her, holding papers, strips of cloth, or old towels in their hands, sometimes still damp, sometimes yellowed with dirt, often worn until they could hardly be used. They kept their heads bowed, as if afraid others would see what they were carrying. When she looked at them, she could not help but recall the warehouse wall in the American camp, stacked with countless white rolls, objects so ordinary they hardly drew attention, yet from a certain angle resembling a baseline that another world had shown her, one she herself had never been allowed to see. One day, a young mother with 3 children approached the counter holding a crumpled ration slip. Her eyes flickered with nervousness, as though she were begging rather than claiming what was hers. In a low voice she asked, "Is there any extra paper?" She spoke so softly, it was as if raising her voice might break some unspoken taboo. As Helene looked at her, the scene overlapped with that of the frail old woman in the American camp infirmary. She reached behind the counter, took out one of the rationed rolls, and gently slid it toward the woman. The mother's breath seemed to pause as she received it, and she thanked her again and again, a shy, almost embarrassed gratitude on her face that made Helene's heart ache dully. She realized that after years of being squeezed, bombed, and told they must endure, the people of this country had grown accustomed to not seeing themselves as worthy of care or respect. From that day on, she made a deep and firm decision. No matter how humble her work, no matter how scarce the supplies, she would do everything she could to ensure that those standing at the counter would no longer feel ashamed of their most basic needs. She no longer saw the roll of paper merely as an object, but as a symbol of decency, of boundaries, of the resolve that we must never go back to what we were. Every morning, as she spread out the distribution forms and lined up the rolls in order, she silently repeated the same thought to herself. Dignity is not a luxury. It should not be squandered, but it must never be stripped away. The years passed slowly. Cities were rebuilt on top of ruins. Children once again ran through the streets, and school bells rang out anew. She saw wall hooks, flush pipes, and toilet rolls reinstalled in public restrooms. Sometimes she would stop involuntarily and stare at those rolls for a few seconds. In her memory, their whiteness carried 2 different weights, one belonging to pre-war innocence, the other to post-war awakening. When she took her own child to a public bath, he reached out and pulled a few sheets, just as any child would, and she froze for a moment as images flashed through her mind. The tremor in her hand the first time she touched a roll in the POW camp, and the shock of seeing that warehouse wall covered in paper. She did not stop or scold him, only gently helped him fold the paper so he would stay clean. When the child looked up at her, she suddenly understood that this was the reason she had struggled to come this far, because in that moment she finally understood. The deepest crime of war is not only its destruction of cities and human lives, but its destruction of people's understanding of what normal means, teaching them to believe that the absence of cleanliness, privacy, and decency is natural, that enduring filth is a virtue, that they can throw away the most basic dignity amid the rubble, and still be told this is for some noble cause. Her own change had been brought about by the most unremarkable of items, a white roll of paper that allowed her to see the baseline she had lost, never possessed, and yet should have shared with everyone. It was not a luxury, nor merely a symbol of wealth, but a fundamental human measure, a scale that determines how high a civilization can stand and how far it can go. Years later, she would sometimes think back to the warehouse in that American camp, to that wall of paper. The rolls were stacked neatly there, without halo or glory, existing in a simple, modest and steady way. It was a symbol she had not understood at the time, but one she would look back on again and again throughout her life. It told her that the true strength of a society lies not only in its steel and weapons, nor in its capacity for mobilization or propaganda, but in how much human decency it is willing to preserve, even for a seemingly worthless enemy girl.